You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Welcome back to the Virtue Podcast, and I have to say, we are finally getting around to doing it the original way. This is going to be a podcast in audio format only today, and I'm so pleased to be welcoming Warren Farha, founder of Eighth Day Books. Warren, welcome.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate it.
Warren, I've run into Eighth Day Books. Perhaps the first time would have been in the pages of either First Things or Touchstone or one of those magazines I was reading, have been reading over the years, where you placed an advertisement. But I didn't really know much about the bookstore until I started to dig around the edges. I think I ordered a few books, of course, and eventually started tracking with you, just a little bit at least. How did you get involved with Eighth Day Books? How did this come to pass?
Well, that story has been originally published in Image, a journal of the arts and religion, back in 2005, and then Martin Cothran edited it, and it appeared again in his journal just last summer, I believe. So the story is of a young man that would be me, about age 33, coming to a fork in the road of his life, needing to choose one path or another. There was a traumatic episode in my life that made me want to examine my vocation. Up until that time, I had been part of a family business, selling building materials and other assorted products from the time I was a 10-year-old child until I was in my early 30s. I loved my family. I loved working with them. But this particular event, which was the loss of my first wife, provoked a lot of questions in me, and I knew that I had to launch out on my own path. And my background in religion and the classics in university and the circle of friends that I inhabited played into that.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been a reader from the time I was 4 years old. And reading is like breathing for me.
Mm-hmm.
I need it in order to live. So in college, I studied religion and classics. My friends and I used to toss around ideas of what the ideal bookstore would contain. This is long before the time of this decision occurred, maybe 10 years before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But when that time came, and this was in 1987, 88, those ideas played into the kind of bookstore I wanted to try. Go ahead.
No, it's what's so fascinating, and you've got this on your website, and I find this intriguing. You say, and I'm quoting here from your website, reality doesn't divide itself into, religious or literary or secular spheres, so we don't either. Apparently, that was a part of the working model that you and your buddies had discussed. You didn't want these things to be so clearly divided or parsed, but rather something more integrated.
Absolutely. And that's the template on which the store was built. So, in our catalog, in the preface to our catalog, which is a whole other story, we quote St. Justin Martyr, the great second century Christian apologist and philosopher, who basically said, paraphrased a bit, that which is true is ours. Speaking
Hmm.
of the early Christian community, that which is true is ours.
Hmm.
It's a simple, it's a simple axiom, and it's a north star for this store. So yes, we stock those things that you would expect: um, theology, philosophy, church history, biblical studies, and so on.
Yeah.
But and especially the writings of the church fathers, let me add, it's
Hmm.
fundamental to who we are. But it doesn't stop there. It has to bleed out into the rest of culture, the rest of human existence. Um, so, in a certain sense, uh, the Brothers Karamazov is absolutely near the center of who we are. Um, Curious George, in its own way, is occupies a space in the good and the true and the beautiful.
Hmm.
We don't. We try our best not to wall off um, one category of truth from another category of truth. We
That
try
may
to
that
all.
must, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to say that must make it tricky, right? In terms of how the books then are displayed, because you're going to have a kind of array, a sort of a selection that sort of merges from one area to another. I assume they all kind of bleed together in some sense.
Well, they do. I mean, practicalities um, make it impossible to absolutely, you know, make the categories merge. You've got to have categories just
Right.
for the sake of your customers. But yeah, we have a lot of books come in that could go in three or four or five different categories, and I think that's because of the demands of our fundamental principles here.
Hmm.
Um,
I'm real. I mentioned how I first came in touch with you as a reader of essentially magazines that were probing in these areas that you
right.
clearly have also emphasized in your selection. What does the typical Eighth Day Book customer look like? I'm sure there's no typical customer, but how do you where do you find folks coming to you from? What are some of their backgrounds? How might you profile them, so to speak?
Okay. From the very foundations of the store, we were determined to represent the best, the very best of each of the great Christian traditions.
Mhm.
Um, Protestant, Catholic, and for the first time in any bookstore that I knew of, bringing orthodoxy to the table of cultural conversation.
Mhm.
Um, so we believe that if you put all the best cards on the table, as a dear friend of mine described it, if you put all the best cards on the table, the truth will emerge. So we have the best of the Reformed tradition, we have the best of the Roman Catholic tradition, we have the best of the Orthodox tradition laid out side by side. But it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop there. It
Mhm.
has to have the best of novels and literature. It has to have the best of poetry, the best of the arts, the best of children's books,
Mhm.
history. We wanted to curate a store that really emphasized the books of perennial interest, books that never get old, books that are
Mhm.
always going to be relevant.
Mhm.
And so we hope that every section of the store manifests that. Um, so the typical customer, um, that's a little bit tricky. We have people who are serious about their faith. We also have people that just drop in off the street who are intrigued, and many for whom religion is a bad word, but who are just fascinated by the selection.
Mm.
And so those folks are as welcome as any faithful Christian in this store.
I love it.
We make it a point not to try to proselytize or pressure anyone into believing one thing or another. We just put the best out there and let them wander.
Funny, just today I was in conversation with one of the speakers who will be joining us later next week at the symposium where Eighth Day Books will be represented. And I asked him, he works in higher education, and I asked him and a handful of colleagues who are going to be on a panel concerning the concerns or the direction that higher education is headed. And he said, when I asked, and how do we make a winsome or compelling argument for the great tradition, as it's sometimes called? And he said,
Yes.
the tradition speaks for itself, which is what I hear you say, that what you have on display there at Eighth Day Books in Wichita speaks for itself, and you're just going to allow those books to make the case for a long-standing or perennial tradition, as you said.
Yeah, that's right on target with what we believe and how we try to live it out here. Myself and the staff, when a person comes in the front doors, we acknowledge their presence. We let them know that we're ready to help if they want help, and then we just leave them alone. And we're confident. We're confident that they can make their way around, and that they'll ask questions if they need to. So that's the way it's been since day one, and that's the way it will always be.
I like.
Go ahead.
I like the fact that there's a kind of gentle, almost silent hospitality, right? That's what I'm hearing.
Absolutely.
I haven't made my pilgrimage yet, Warren, I must confess, right? I've often said, if I could just get out to Wichita, I'd have to drop in. When I've met your colleagues on different occasions at different events, I'm like, I got to get out there. This is an amazing selection. Even what they've got on display at a given conference, which is only, just a small selection from within the larger collection. It's on my list. It's on my bucket list, as they say, Warren. I'm headed to Wichita. I just got to figure out to make an excuse to come out and see it and witness it for myself.
Well, we would love that. Go ahead.
Well, obviously, the next best thing was to bring you to Phoenix, or to bring you to our own event. And so pleased that some of your team will be headed down next week to join us at the Phoenix Convention Center. I mention that only because, of course, and have seen our roster of speakers and panelists, and you're going to be bringing representative books from their work, from their various publications. How do you go about the kind of sifting and culling process when you do head to an event like our own? How do you find the books, the titles, and then make sure that you're doing your best to represent that which is being offered in a given event?
Right. So I should say at this point, I look carefully at conference themes. I look carefully at the roster of speakers and presenters, and that roster is formidable, perhaps more than anywhere else at this conference in Phoenix. We consider it our first responsibility when we attend a conference to have a representation of all the speakers' published works as best we can. Sometimes that's not always possible. but that's our goal. And then we do something like a curation of our curation that's already here in the store. I personally scan through all the shelves in the relevant categories, and I pull a selection that I feel like best fits the nature of the attendees and the conference speakers. We spend several days, well, I spend weeks in preparation, studying the roster and ordering the books, and we spend days actually pulling the books that will go to the conference. So that's the process we're in right now. I mean, we are getting ready to start pulling the selection for the Great Hearts Phoenix Conference. So yeah, that's.
Well, I just want to say thanks, because it wasn't a small task with the number of speakers we have. Between the panelists and the scholars, there's clearly scores of individuals. Probably half of them, at least half of them, have published works. And as such, to bring representation from them is quite a feat. Plus, you've got to load this up and bring it down from Kansas. This isn't a drop ship situation, is it?
It's not. Practically speaking, it would be. Well, we've tried it once, a conference in New York City, and to ship all of the books there, and then land someone there to handle receiving them, setting them up, and then packing them up to send back to Wichita is harder than just driving out and doing it ourselves. I mean, so we have driven nationwide. I mean, we've gone all the way from Los Angeles to Massachusetts to South Carolina, and very much in the Midwest. We've gone to, I think I can say without exaggeration, hundreds of events. Each event is a little different. Each event has its own challenges, its own distances, its own problems with the venues. Yeah, each event is a process. But I mean, I think it's gotten our name out there like no other process could. People can actually see what we do, and if a conference speaker is compelling, they want to take it home with them.
That's right.
And it's an ideal environment in which to sell books.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is a fundamental part of what we do in our store as a whole. You know, we're a brick and mortar store where people come in the front door. We go off-site to sell books. We sell books online. We do school book fairs, whatever it takes to keep us viable and operating. And there have been some tough times in the midst of that.
Oh, I can only imagine. And I remember last year, the first time we had your mobile unit deployed to Phoenix at the convention center. We gave a little shout in the direction of your setup, and folks began to clamor. This year, we've set it up so that it's visible, right, from everywhere within the ballroom, right? You're sort of immediately adjacent. And I'm really keen on trying to call out from the main stage those authors and titles that you're going to have at the ready just as soon as speakers step down from the podium, right? They'll be able to get the books, as you say. Something very human about the very human and sort of small scale about what you've done, Warren. I wonder
incarnational.
It's very incarnational. I like that. Well, then
Um,
how does that compare, right, with some of the? I mean, we talk about big box stores and Amazon, obviously, or other bookstores that one might find online. This is distinct. This is distinct at Eighth Day Books. How are you faring in relation to that market competition, right, for book sales in particular? How do you continue to make it viable, as you said?
yeah, I would want to say that the last 4 or 5 years have been our best years, especially the last 2 years, partially because of COVID and people being home wanting to read. So our online
Hmm.
sales have surged, and that brings even more notoriety to us. But basically, it's just um, a habit of endurance, a habit of persistence, of just showing up
Hmm.
every day. And there have been various stages of the challenge. Okay, when I first opened in '88, in the early '90s, you had the arrival of the big box bookstore, the Barnes and Nobles, the
Hmm.
Borders, huge stores that just dwarf what we can do in a store our size. And that's where the specialty of selection really helped us back then. Then, of course, you had the rise of online book selling, specifically Amazon. So that sort of made itself felt in the early 2000s for us, but we just kept showing up, and we had people that preferred an incarnational experience. Um, they didn't want a Gnostic experience, a
Right.
virtual experience of books, referring then to the rise of digital books in the early 2010s.
Hmm.
So all of these stages have presented different challenges to us. And, of course, we still face them every day. Somebody can sit down at their desk or sit down with their phone, for goodness sakes, and just click a few buttons and they can buy any specific book they want.
Right.
Um, we're aware of that. We're not naive about that. We understand that we have to offer something different, and that difference is the curation. Um, and for people who can actually come into our store, a whole global experience of the great transcendentals, of the good, the true, and the beautiful,
Mm.
incarnated in books. So
Yeah.
that's what we've been doing for 35 years almost.
It's amazing. I want to make sure that the audience knows, not only do you have this lovely store, again, I haven't seen it, but all accounts are a lovely and very hospitable place there in Wichita. But there are a number of other elements that have sort of grown out of the bookstore, including your own press. One of your colleagues shared with me Andrew Louth's Discerning the Mystery, which was just it was one of those uh, imagination shaping encounters for me, and I don't think I would have discovered it, right, had it not been recommended, but it was, and it's certainly one of my top 10 of all time, in part because Eighth Day Press has published it. So tell me a little more about Eighth Day Press and anything else that's coming out of the bookstore and the community that you formed there in Wichita.
Well, the press is a kind of a serendipitous offshoot of the store, and that we wanted to bring back um, into availability books that we knew were really great books and that had gone out of print or were no longer easily available. So Andrew Louth's book was one. Um, and the original intention was to reprint books that were out of print or in public domain, perhaps. But
Hmm.
as it happened, the first book we published was a book called The Feast of Friendship by Father Paul O'Callahan, which um, brought together um, meditations on the meaning of friendship along with theological concerns and the concerns of moral formation in the human person. So anyway, that was our first publication. It was an original publication. But since then, we've published books like Discerning the Mystery, and also of special interest both to us and to the public, I think, is Max Picard's World of Silence, which is, I can only describe it as a singular book. There's no other book that is like it. Well, it's poetry, but it's in prose form. And it leads you into theological and philosophical realms that this author could never have done in a real discursive manner. He does it in short, elusive passages that just stop you in your tracks. Anyway, that's been one of our more notable publications. We're a very small press with only a very few titles to our credit, but that's the motivation behind that. But returning to your original question of other outgrowths of the store, the principal one would be that founded by Aaron Doom, who will be our representative there in Phoenix, who back in 2007-8 founded Eighth Day Institute, which is a nonprofit organization intended to bring together Christians of all three of the great traditions and require that they face each other's differences, face each other's strengths, in fellowship with each other. So it's purposefully ecumenical, but ecumenical in the best sense of the word, not a sort of flabby sense of ecumenical and just being nice to each other. It means facing each other with all your differences, so that you can actually wrestle with the issues involved between these great traditions and unite where we are truly united. And I think you could say that's the Nicene Creed. That would be the the fundamental uniting point for all of us. Anyway, Aaron started this venture back in 2008, and he's maintained it for these last 15 years. So he's Eighth Day Institute sponsors symposia every year, early in mid-January usually, where speakers from each of the great traditions come together and address a specific theme. Ad Fontes is another conference that's sponsored by EDI. It happens in early June, and it is purposefully an academic conference, inviting participants to present serious academic papers, again, addressing an agreed upon theme. And then finally, there's the Inkling Fest in October, which is a fun for all conference. It's a family conference. The focus is the Inklings, Lewis, Tolkien, Charles Williams, etc. George MacDonald, a rising presence. So
this very go ahead.
Let me just finish that by saying how it started. Aaron Doom worked here for 8 years, but he had always had a vision of an educational community. That's the very broad way to to describe it.
Mhm.
And so when he left our employment here, he launched into this project. And it always reminded me of a time shortly after the store opened, sometime in the early 90s. And a customer had purchased his books, and he was sitting in a common chair in the front room near the counter, and he said, you need to have an educational aspect to this place. This is a remarkable place, and you need to take it outside these walls. And I've always remembered that in the later founding of Aaron Doom's vision, Eighth Day Institute. So they are a separate entity. They are a nonprofit. We are a for-profit operation, but we're related hand in glove.
Well, it's a lovely project. As I've poked around a bit on the website, I even recognize a few of the faces that are there in Cameo. Looks like our friend Pano Canellis might have visited with you for one of the sessions. Yes. On one occasion, and a photograph was taken, ended up on your website. Not surprisingly, as Pano certainly shares, I think the vision for this pursuit of truth, this unceasing interest, right, in exploring the tradition, as you put it, and that's certainly what we're up to with our efforts at the upcoming symposium. I think what your Eighth Day Institute seems to represent is this return, as the nomenclature suggests, right? The ad fontes, to sources, to the origins, to the fountain, if you will, that provides us the encouragement that a tradition is trustworthy, that there are ways in which the statements of truth that are promulgated through the tradition have stood the test. They've been tested. They've been scrutinized. They've been tested time and again, both internally and often externally, right, through various attacks. But they've stood the test, and we do well to recover that tradition in our understanding of a historical rootedness of which we are participants in. So I love what I'm seeing there. Do you have with EDI, with Eighth Day Institute, a sort of calendar, as you've mentioned it, of several things then that are going to be happening throughout the year?
Well, the three conferences I just mentioned are kind of fixed on the calendar. The biggest, the symposium, is in mid to late January every year. Ad Fontes is in the first week of June, and the Inkling Fest about the third weekend in October. And so we have people attending those from all over the country at this point.
Something for every season.
What's that?
Something for every season, as it were.
That's right. That's right. And for every kind of audience.
Yep.
All the way from Ad Fontes, which is academic, to Inkling Fest, which is very family oriented, to the symposium, which is a little bit of both, but it's challenging, and it brings together the best, or we try to bring representatives of the best representatives of each tradition together. Eighth Day Institute has had I don't know what you call it. It's called the Hall of Men, and so twice a month, a bunch of guys get together, and they have a meal together, and they might have a beer or two, and then someone gives a lecture on a great figure in the history of the church or just the history of culture, who kind of express the principles of EDI. And that's been going on for 13 years without
Mm.
fail. Um, these guys love to get together and learn. And again, it's a very ecumenical span. Um, More recently, the Sisters of Sophia was founded to do the same sort of thing for the women,
Uh-huh.
and they present great heroes of women in the history of the church and
Hmm.
culture. So those are the sorts of things that are ongoing at the Eighth Day Institute. There are reading groups, um, just lots of opportunities to get together and to learn.
And from
Uh,
what I can tell on the website, always that sense, again, back to the hospitality, we're going to gather for a meal, right? We're going to sit down,
that's
break
right.
bread, and have a conversation that may go on into the wee hours of the morning, but it's going to be something good, both for the palate and for the soul. And it really is suggestive of, as you said at the outset, the incarnational dimension of our nature, of our human nature. I think it's just lovely. Warren, are there other big projects? I mean, you've essentially spawned not only EDI and the press, and I'm assuming that Wichita community knows you well because you've been there for 35 years. Are there any other big projects just over the horizon? Any other publications we should be on the lookout for coming out of Eighth Day?
Well, um,
As if this wasn't enough, everything we've talked about.
there's a big project. There's a big project that's just a week from now on the
Okay.
horizon, and
Okay.
that's your conference, Robert. That's a large project for us,
Mhm.
and and you know we we are hard at work just doing the things that we do. Um, I guess the next large project would be the next catalog,
Mhm.
which has been a mark of Eighth Day Books since actually 1989. This is a a catalog which started out at 24 pages and grew to 170 pages, filled with book reviews that we and our staff and our Eighth Day community um, put together on all the different categories that we love. And it has become much loved by a certain slice of our clientele
Mhm.
that don't live here locally in Wichita.
Right.
So we started mailing out all over the country in the late 80s, early 90s. Um, the First Things mailing list was kind of a template for us in getting out to a community that would be like-minded and that would be interested in our books.
Mhm.
And so at a certain point in the late 90s, we were sending out 30,000 of these catalogs.
Oh my goodness.
Um, I mean, it's a major project. Just the writing, the engagement with the text, the writing of a blurb that expresses the essence of these texts, and then putting it together into a logical stream of reviews. Um, it's really a huge task,
Mm, mm. I can
and
only imagine.
we did it every year and sometimes twice a year from '89 till 2012, and then the expenses of publication and mailing and the onslaught of online bookselling sort of required that we put it in abeyance for a while.
Mhm.
But 3 years ago, we sent out our next one, and that was very well received. People loved it. we've have catalog customers who have kept their old catalogs and continue to order from them.
Hmm.
In the late 90s, we would get a stack of orders every day, mail orders, people actually filling out an ink and paper order form
Uh-huh.
and mailing it with a stamp, Wichita, Kansas.
That's
That
old
was
school,
that was a
Warren.
different
That's old
world.
school.
It's old school as you can get, but there are some people who love that world,
Hmm.
and so yeah, I guess you would say that our next large project is just getting our act together and sitting down and writing some book reviews and putting together catalog number 23 for people that still love ink and paper and
Well, I
don't want
definitely, yeah, I
to
definitely
sit in
count
front of a
myself.
computer
I
to
definitely count
shop.
myself among them. And
Yeah,
I thought this is helpful, this background, because we relocated in 2013, and I knew that I no longer got my Eighth Day book catalog, and thought, well, it must have been a change of address. And then, of course, one thing led to another, and I forgot to even inquire as to whether
right.
there was a catalog. It sounds like, as you say, it went into abeyance and just came back. Now that I'm in Phoenix, I'm going to have to send you my address and get back on that catalog mailing list, because I do too enjoy what your community has produced by way of readers and discerning readers, and those who are interested in these timeless truths as we can discuss them as they're manifest in the great tradition, and as we continue, hopefully, to prompt and perhaps even generate, under the influence of good education, the next generation, right, of authors who will express those perennial truths afresh for our moment and for this day. So thankful for the work you're doing, Warren, there in Wichita, and determined to get up there and give you a visit, to see it, to make a pilgrimage. Apparently, that's what some folks think of it as, and that's the way I would consider it. I got to get up there to visit with you, but I'm glad that in the meantime, you're bringing your mobile crew down here, that you've spent those hours, and I'm sure it's hours upon hours, in the discernment of which volumes to send down our way next week. Thank you for that in advance, and I look forward to seeing Aaron and seeing your display and staying in touch with you, and hopefully becoming a little more involved with Eighth Day Books in the days and months ahead.
Robert, thank you. I mean, I hope we can prove worthy of your confidence in us next week, and we'll give it our best shot. We're glad to be involved in your heroic efforts and that of the classical education world as a whole. We think it's one of the most promising signs of cultural renewal that there is in this country. So thank you, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure, Warren. I look forward to meeting Aaron. You let me know when that train arrives. By train, of course, I'm referring to the truck and the trailer. I'll be there. I'll be there for drop off and pick up to help as best I can. All right. You let him
Thank
know.
you, sir. Thank you very much.
Take care, Warren.
You too.